What are the other great feasts of pilgrimage and remembrance?
The Feast of Shavuot, weeks, begins 7 weeks after Passover. Originally coinciding with the wheat harvest, the Feast of Weeks recalls Israel's spiritual harvest of the divine law at Sinai. The feast occurs on Sivan 6th, a day longer outside Israel. The 50th day, Pentecost in Greek, after Passover, marking the end of the days of the Omer, sheaf. In reference to the ancient practice of bringing the first sheaves of barley as temple offering. The third of the great holidays is Sukkot, the Feast of Booths, or Tabernacles. 5 days after the Day of Atonement, from Tishri 15 to 23, a day longer outside Israel except in Reform congregations. Jews celebrate this harvest festival marking the end of the vintage season. Many families construct small symbolic structures in the backyard, recalling as they take their meals there how God sheltered the people through the wilderness of the Exodus. Along with Passover and weeks, this was a pilgrimage feast before the destruction of the temple. When many traveled to Jerusalem to celebrate, families bless 4 plants as symbols of unity in diversity. Holding in the left hand a citrus called the ethrog, and in the right a bound cluster of 1 palm, 2 willow, and 3 myrtle branches, together called the lulav. They make gestures of blessing and sing Hosanna, save us.
What kinds of special ritual objects figure in Shinto worship and prayer?
Shinto tradition refers to all of its ritual furniture and utensils with the term saikigo. It includes several items used on every altar during offering ceremonies. The priest carries the offerings, hihaku, and gifts of food, shinzen, on a tray, sambo, which he sets upon an 8-legged table, hasekuin, made of a special reddish cypress wood, hinoki, fire tree. Priestly staff remove these objects after worship ends. Objects used regularly in nearly all rituals include several items that ritual specialists wave over those to whom they are ministering. Branches of the sakeke, combining characters for tree and kami, provide a splash of greenery and association with living nature. A wand used for purification, either in place of or in conjunction with the sakeke branch, is called harigushi, a thick cluster of white paper streamers attached to a long stick. Another stick with a set of zigzag cut white, and sometimes of other colors. Paper symbolizes the kami's presence in the holy place. All 3 objects are mounted on stands and displayed when not in use by one of the priests or a miko. Miko also use a set of 5 bells, suzu, for their sacred dances. Several larger implements play a central role in the great public festivals called matsuri. Most important is the portable shrine called the mikoshi. Celebrants carry this miniature, but still often very heavy, 4-sided model of a shrine sanctuary in procession, shouldering long beams that hold the shrine aloft. Larger mikosi can weigh up to several tons and require a large crew of strong bearers. In some places large wagons called yatai and dashi rumble through the streets on massive wheels, carrying groups of musicians and revelers. Built like mobile shrines. The hefty wooden wagons range in height from just over 30 feet to about 65 feet.
Is there a standard Islamic group liturgical worship?
Islamic ritual prayer, performed 5 times daily, is called salat, from a root that means to make holy. Whenever Muslims gather, they perform the ritual prayer together. That applies not only to the prescribed Friday midday congregational prayer but to any of the set times at which 2 or more Muslims come together any day of the week, whether in the mosque or elsewhere. As with all Muslim ritual practice, worshippers preface this prayer with the clearly stated intention. Naya, pronounced Niya, saying I intend to pray the dawn, for example, salat. From 2 to 4 cycles of standing, bowing to place hands on knees, ruku, pronounced rukoo. Sitting on the heels, jalsa, pronounced jalsa, stretching forward toward prostration. Sajda, pronounced sajda, to place hands flat on the floor at shoulder width. And touching the forehead to the floor, make up the fundamental salat ritual. The number of cycles, rak'ah, pronounced rak'ah, depends on which prescribed prayer one is performing.
How does the practice of almsgiving express Muslims' sense of community?
Zakat, pronounced zakaat, almsgiving, is one of the 5 pillars. It requires all financially stable Muslims to contribute varying amounts, depending on the type of goods being taxed. For example, it comes to 10% of agricultural produce in general, but 2.5% of a person's savings or profits over and above what one needs to live. There are many ways of calculating the matter these days. What is most important to understand about religious almsgiving is that for Muslims it is an institutionalized form of social concern. Muslim authorities see to the distribution of the funds among the neediest, both at home and abroad. The United Arab Emirates, for example, might earmark charitable funds for building an airstrip, for the delivery of desperately needed supplies to the Albanian Muslim refugees from Kosovo. Devout Muslims are encouraged to give far beyond the minimum zakat as well. At the end of the month-long fast of Ramadan, many give generously to the zakat al-fitr, or alms for the breaking of the fast. Those and all other voluntary charitable donations are called sadaqah. Pronounced sadaqah, righteousness, uprightness. For through these signs of social concern individual Muslims gain blessing and forgiveness. A related practice among Shi'i Muslims is the khums or fifth. The tax was originally the custom of providing the Prophet a portion of the military spoils. but some Shiite religious authorities have collected it from their constituencies up to modern times as an offering for the 12th Imam expected to return at the end of time.
Who are the Shivites?
At least 6 sub-denominations make up Shaiva Hinduism. As with Vaishnavism, their views on the nature of the divine-human relationship set them apart. A major sect in South and Southeast Indian region called Tamil Nadu is known as Shiva Siddhanta, truth about Shiva. Tracing its roots to Rishi Termular, c. 200 CE, the group's central teaching is a blend of the ism and monism, individual souls seek God. And devotees and worshippers in this life and ultimately will merge totally with Shiva. Pashupata Shaivism, founded by Lakolasha, c. 200, and popular in far northeast, north, and western central India, holds a variation on that teaching. Souls finally merge with God but maintain individuality somewhat. As stars are lost as discrete bodies in the infinite night sky. Also found in the northern state of Kashmir is a distinctive Shaiva sect founded by Vasugupta, c. 800 CE. The Kashmiri school is monistic, teaching the complete and perfect oneness of all reality in Shiva. A major sect in northeast India is called Siddha Siddhanta, with roots in the teaching or Rishi Gorakshanatha. c. 950 CE. Blending the ism and monism. This school says all individual things are eventually reabsorbed into Shiva as bubbles arise in water. A minor group still influential in southern India is called Shiva Advaita. Its first teacher, Shrikanta, c. 1050. Preferred a qualified theism in which the worshipper participates in divinity without losing identity. Finally, a major sect in southwest Indian is known as Virashaivism. Members are sometimes referred to as Lingayats because many carry with them in a small case a miniature Shiva Linga. A major poet called Basavana, 1105–67, remains an influential source of the sect's teaching of qualified theism, according to which God is like the sun, souls its rays.
How are Confucian or CIT leaders chosen and given authority?
Priestly orders or classes in many traditions derive their authority from either hereditary lineage or from a perceived ability to manage spiritual power, or both of these. The case of the literati as a special class is quite different in many respects. Their role in imperial religious affairs may have originated with the office of royal astrologer. A person possessed of a special type of arcane knowledge. They had to understand all there was to know about how to plan imperial matters in perfect coordination with the rhythms of the cosmos. But the literati's continued prestige rested on their identification with a broader range of knowledge, that of literature, history, and writing. their privileged access to the canonical texts. The classics and books of Confucian tradition gave them unquestioned authority. The literati oversaw virtually every detail of imperial ritual and administration, so much of which was highly ritualized, and were responsible for propriety and auspiciousness in all affairs of the state under heaven. They were, in effect, a kind of lay priesthood whose patron and model was Confucius. Prospective members of the literati underwent extensive education designed to imbue them with the classical texts. An exquisite sensitivity to the nuances of ritual, and an appreciation of the social and political implications of the relationships implied in the great rituals. Literati achieved their various ranks within the hierarchical structure on the basis of their achievement in the imperial examinations. From about the 7th century CE on, an elaborate system of examinations could give access to any of 3 degrees or ranks, each requiring as many as 10 different kinds of examination. The Board of Rites oversaw the examinations, and the Board of Civil Office made the final appointments. An important feature of this system was that, at least in theory, it bestowed authority on the basis of personal achievement rather than heredity or social status. The higher the rank of a local government's main official, the greater the prestige of its ancestral temple.
What happens to texts not judged worthy of inclusion in the primary canon?
Judaism and Christianity, for example, characterize works of secondary value as apocrypha. Hidden because originally associated with esoteric groups, or pseudepigrapha, works written under assumed names. Study of canon formation is very instructive in the history of religion, since it reveals a great deal about how certain beliefs and teachings came to be regarded as central to a tradition.
What's the difference between Sephardic and Ashkenazic Jews?
Prior to 1492 there were large Jewish communities on the Iberian Peninsula, modern-day Spain, and Portugal. During the final phases of the Catholic reconquest of Spain, Jews were given the option of converting or going into exile. Many of those who chose to leave migrated all over the Mediterranean basin, including North Africa and the Middle East, to found new communities. These descendants of Iberian Jewry are called Sephardic Jews. They comprise a small minority, perhaps 20% or less, of the global Jewish population. Sephardic Jews retain a number of distinctive ritual and legal interpretations, and in some places manage to preserve the Ladino language of their ancestral Iberia and maintain separate educational institutions. By far the majority of Jews are Ashkenazim. Their name derives from the medieval Hebrew designation of Central Europe as Ashkenaz. Descendants of the early Jewish settlers in Central and Eastern Europe preserve Ashkenazic traditions all over the world. Most Jewish immigrants to the United States have been Ashkenazim. Although the majority of the earliest, in colonial times, were Sephardim. In general, Jews in the Americas have not maintained a serious distinction between Sephardic and Ashkenazic customs and practices. And few synagogues nowadays restrict membership one way or the other.
Are there any links between dreams or visions and personifications of holiness and power?
Dreams and visions serve a number of important functions in religious traditions. Accounts of dreams and visions often describe an important figure's meeting with a still more important figure, including even the Supreme Being. The experience described is often that of the dreamer or visionary receiving some special teaching or revelation. Dreams naturally tend to be more private. Though famous religious figures have sometimes published extensive records of their dreaming states. Visions, on the other hand, occasionally become a rallying point for large numbers of believers. The visionary lets it be known that he or she has been privileged to encounter some important spiritual presence at a certain place or under certain circumstances. In some cases, the visionary claims assurance that further visions will occur on a timetable that has been revealed. Devotees may thereafter begin to gather in hopes of sharing the visions. For some people, the prospect of visionary experience assumes enormous importance. Almost as if visions constitute the only credible form of religious experience. Visions and dreams can also function as vehicles of legitimation or induction of the subject into the ranks of some spiritual confraternity. These experiences amount to a kind of ultimate endorsement. With the dreamer or visionary now able to assert a higher level of authority on the basis of an exchange with some holy person.
Why are some Eastern Christian groups called Orthodox and others Catholic?
As early as the 5th century, Eastern Christians identified themselves as Orthodox in distinction to the various heretical factions whose views the Council of Chalcedon had condemned in 451. When the iconoclastic controversy ended in 842, Eastern Christian authorities declared the first feast of Orthodoxy. At that time, the term distinguished the right belief of all supporters of image veneration from all who opposed that essential part of liturgy and devotion. Since the definitive disconnection of several major Eastern churches from papal authority, the term has generally distinguished them from the Uniat, or Eastern Catholic communities that retained or renewed ties to Rome. Eastern Catholic churches include members of the Antiochian, Chaldean, Alexandrine, and Byzantine traditions. Individual bodies are the Ukrainian, Maronite, Armenian, Coptic, Ethiopian, Ruthenian, and Melkite, several of which also have their Orthodox counterparts.
Could you sum up the Buddha's classical teaching on how a good life might unfold?
Any person who wishes to make sense of life must begin by hearing the Dharma. Seeking to understand the teaching of the utterly trustworthy Buddha. Translating the teaching into action means abiding by the fundamental recommendations and rules of conduct for living a moral life. Moving a step beyond the ethical minimum requires a person to seek greater personal discipline by guarding the senses and doing whatever is necessary to avoid the subtle corrosion of evil influences. That in turn inevitably leads to a higher level of mindfulness and awareness of each moment. This may seem at first to suggest a bland, even incredibly boring, life. But Buddhist tradition insists, paradoxically perhaps, that this alone can offer genuine appreciation and enjoyment, true bliss. Only such enlarged awareness is really worth the name living. For everything else is life on autopilot, a sure recipe for stress and frustration. At some point the seeker will need to pursue serious training in meditation. Meditative discipline aims immediately to help the seeker identify and neutralize sources of anxiety and uncertainty. A kind of spiritual map for serious seekers is called the 12-spoked wheel of conditioned arising. It describes in schematic fashion the cycle by which ignorance gives rise to intent to act, which in turn gives rise to consciousness, awareness of name and body, capacity for sense contact. Actual contact, sensation, craving, grasping, becoming, birth, old age, and death. The seeker must in effect work backward through the chain of conditions to eliminate the ignorance at the root. Those who persevere along this path hope to arrive at a genuinely contemplative approach to life and ultimately, at spiritual liberation. This classical teaching clearly lays out a difficult and demanding path. Relatively few are able to follow it consistently. That is one of the reasons that more popular forms of Buddhist devotion and practice have had a broader appeal.
What other early scriptures are especially important for Hindus?
Over a span of perhaps 2,000 years, c. 3000 to 1000 BCE, according to some Indian scholars, Hindu ritual specialists produced a substantial body of sacred literature by way of commentary and reflection on the Vedas. The earliest of these works were manuals for priests, or brahmanas, each attached to one of the four Vedas. These brahmanas elaborated on the mythic stories to which the Vedic hymns often had made only passing allusions. Expanding on the tradition much as the early Jewish rabbis had developed the oral Torah, the brahmanas served the practical purpose of recording for posterity precise directions for correct ritual performance. Still another layer of scriptural development gave rise to a series of works called Aranyakas, forest treatises. composed by and for hermits. These texts offered further commentary on the Vedas meant to foster the contemplative life. Aranyakas were connected with the Brahmanas much as the Brahmanas were linked to the various Vedas. With their emphasis on inward reflection, the Aranyakas signal an important turn away from the ancient Vedic and Brahmanical reliance on external ritual. Another type of sacred text called the Upanishads evolved from about 1500 to 500 BCE. The name Upanishad means, loosely, sitting at the feet of a mentor. These remarkable documents, many in the form of a dialogue between teacher and student, reflect deeply on the nature of the divine and of the self. Life's true meaning rests not primarily in dealing with forces beyond human control, but in understanding both the ultimate causes of all things and the relationship of the self to those causes. The Upanishads represent major developments known collectively as Vedanta, the end or culmination of the Vedas.
What about more specific directives?
One of the earliest scriptures in the Pali Canon is the Vinaya Pitaka, the basket of discipline. Buddhist law generally emphasizes the thou shalt nots over the thou shalts. On the negative side, the Vinaya lists several hundred actions considered offensive and unacceptable behavior for monks and nuns. Of those, some 250 apply to monks and 348 to nuns. Topping the list for all monks and nuns is a group of 10 precepts that forbid lying, intoxicating substances, adultery, theft, killing, eating after noon, elegant beds, cosmetics, frivolous entertainment, and possession of luxuries. The first 5 also apply to lay persons, who might also choose to observe the next 3 on the 4 special monthly duty days or Sabbaths. Monks and nuns are automatically expelled from the monastic community for killing a human being or an animal. Grand larceny, or sexual misconduct. Other important categories in monastic law include offenses that require a community consultation, those that call for restitution of some kind, return of goods improperly received, and issues of due process in resolving problems. Apart from these specific regulations, Buddhist teaching offers a number of more general guidelines for lay people. It recommends, for example, seeking adequate income, acquiring a professional skill, frugality, freedom from debt, and giving generously to good causes.
Were Confucians in conflict with their emperor?
In 213 BCE, Emperor Qin Shi Huang accepted the recommendation of his prime minister, Li Si, that all books except the history books about Qin be burned. Li made this recommendation to strengthen Qin's authority and to give him greater control over the scholarly class. All the books of lyrics and the writings of the various schools of thought were to be brought to Governors of prefectures for burning, those who had these books and would not burn them within 30 days were to have their faces branded, then be sent to labor for 4 years on the Great Wall. Those who dared to talk about these books were to be executed. Those who quoted the past to criticize the present were to be killed together with their entire families. Those who knew of and did not report violations were to suffer the same punishment. The only books that were not to be burned, apart from histories of Qin, were books on medicine, divination, and tree planting. During the next year, 212 BCE, some Confucian scholars and magicians talked among themselves, accusing the emperor of being power-hungry, prone to kill and punish, and neglectful of intellectuals. When Qin Shi Huang learned of their dissent, he ordered a thorough investigation, during which the scholars blamed each other, rather than admitting to the criticisms. Finally, it was discovered that more than 460 scholars were involved. Qin Shi Huang ordered them all buried alive in the capital.
Was Shinto associated with the samurai code?
Japan's fabled tradition of samurai warriors did have important connections with Shinto. But it did not arise out of Shinto alone or even primarily. Some credit a 17th-century Japanese Confucian scholar and military theorist named Yamaga-Soko (1622–1685) as the originator of the Way of the Warrior, Bushido. Yamaga emphasized the importance of sincerity and utter devotion to the ancestral kami as a sure road to experiencing the divine presence. Along with other thinkers of his time, he focused on the concept of Amaterasu as the ancestral kami of the imperial family. Total devotion to the ancestral kami therefore implied perfect allegiance to the person of the emperor, the shogun, and the territorial feudal lords called daimyo. Feudal society depended on the loyalty of its samurai, the knightly or military class. Even after the shogunate and the feudal system gave way to a rejuvenated imperial government under the Meiji Restoration, military supporters of the emperor turned the code of unquestioning dedication to good effect by underscoring the necessity of unstinting affection for the royal person and his household.
After Muhammad died and the Arab armies expanded into new territories and encountered new cultures and religious communities, the Muslims had to confront countless problems previously unknown. How would they deal with issues that neither the Quran nor the Hadith addressed?
Local Muslim leaders often had to improvise, exercising their best personal judgment and acting as they believed Muhammad would have done. They strove to perpetuate the Prophet's example, his sunnah. But authorities and leading scholars in Medina, and later in other cities, looked for ways to standardize the procedure of extending the application of Quran and Hadith to changing circumstances. they gradually agreed that one could solve problems not treated directly in Quran and Hadith by appealing to the actual practice of the local community or to the consensus. Ijma, pronounced IJMAA, of legal scholars. But since some questions were too new for any consensus to have developed, scholars agreed that one could apply a form of reasoning by analogy, qiyas, pronounced qyaas, that followed strict rules so as to keep the process as free of personal whim as possible. Leading legal scholars in different cities devised slightly different formulas for using the four roots of the law: Quran, Hadith, consensus, and analogical reasoning, some allowing greater latitude in appealing to the third and fourth roots. Four legal methodologies dominant among Sunni Muslims came to be called the schools. Madhabs, while several other distinctively Shi'i schools eventually developed as well.
How did Lao Zi become deified?
There seem to have been a number of stages in that process. First, the legendary figure began as a teacher and writer, whose image eventually blended with that of the Yellow Emperor when Lao Zi came to be identified as a confidant of royalty. Traditional accounts, such as the life story summarized above, transformed him into a cultural hero whose mother had conceived him virginally. By the mid-2nd century CE, Lao Zi had become the deity who delivered to Zhang Dao Ling the revelation of a new religious faith, giving rise to the Celestial Masters School. But his image was still not complete. Next, perhaps also around the 2nd or 3rd century CE, Lao Zi seems to have been identified as a creator god who also enters the world to rescue humanity from tribulation. Lao Zi was now capable of incarnating himself, almost like a Buddhist bodhisattva. Not long thereafter he joined the triad of the three pure ones. And finally Lao Zi emerged as the chief divine person. We have here one of the more interesting examples of apotheosis, or deification, in the history of religion.
What are some basic Hindu ethical considerations?
Hindu tradition describes a range of morally and religiously acceptable goals or motives for action. What matters most is not the substance of the particular type of goal, but the quality of one's intentions. All good things in life are gifts of God. One has only to learn how best to use and value them. In the greater scheme of things, three of the four major goals are means rather than ends in themselves. Even so, a devout Hindu can pursue them with vigor and determination, as long as the pursuit is balanced and not obsessive. Most fundamental is the goal of Dharma, the quest for one's own individual ethical calling in accord with the cosmic law that holds all things together. Personal justice and righteousness are the cardinal virtues. but wealth, material success, power, and social status, artha, are also worthy goals, so long as one keeps them in perspective. People who use their worldly success in ethically laudable ways are exercising responsible stewardship and can make wonderful things happen for the benefit of many. In addition, a devout Hindu can enjoy to the full all of life's legitimate pleasures. Associated with culture, the arts, sexuality, and family life. This traditional teaching undercuts the common stereotype of Hinduism as world-rejecting and self-denying asceticism. On the other hand, the opposite stereotype that identifies Hinduism as the kind of wild-eyed lust sometimes associated with the Kama Sutra is equally inappropriate. Ultimately, Hindu tradition teaches the sincere seeker will find that none of the first three goals offers permanent satisfaction. What remains is the quest for final liberation from the enslavement that goes with even well-moderated attachments. Moksha, meaning release, is the only goal worthy of being considered an end in itself. Most people will spend many lifetimes striving for it.
How do Hindus view Hinduism's relationships to other traditions?
For many centuries the greater Hindu tradition has shown enormous flexibility in adapting to religious pluralism. It came to be the greater Hinduism, in part at least, because of that quality of expansiveness. Many Hindus regard their religious heritage as a kind of spiritual umbrella capable of sheltering all who seek refuge beneath it. Historically, different denominations have drawn one separate traditions into their embrace. For example, Vaishnavite tradition came to incorporate Buddhism by installing the Buddha as the ninth of Vishnu's 10 avatars, a hospitable gesture, perhaps, but one that Buddhists do not recognize. Some Hindus have suggested that Jesus and other foundational figures also find a place in the greater Hindu scheme of things. A major early modern movement that began as an attempt to soften the animosity between Hindus and Muslims in northwestern India especially is now known as Sikhism. The Sikh community has become largely identified with a region called the Punjab, which straddles the India-Pakistan border. Sikh separatists have continued to assert their desire for a homeland.
When and where did Buddhism begin?
Buddhism began in a region of northeast India, part of which is present-day Nepal. During the mid-6th century BCE the kingdom of Koshala ruled the area from its capital city of Shravasthi, also known as Kapilavastu. One of the realm's leading factions was the Shakya clan, traditionally identified as belonging to the Kshatriya or warrior caste. India at that time was politically fragmented into well over a dozen major regional powers. The vast majority of the population practiced forms of Hindu tradition under the leadership of a strong Brahmin priesthood. Ritual and belief centered largely on this worldly concerns, such as managing weather to ensure good harvest and curing illness. But some who had inherited the ancient tradition were beginning to question its efficacy. The famed holy city of Benares was part of the Koshala realm. There and elsewhere in the kingdom, individuals and small groups of religious seekers raised issues about possible life after death, including the notion of rebirth into other modes of existence. Within the Hindu tradition, the new questioning gave rise to the scriptures called the Upanishads. With their deep reflection on the nature of the self and of greater spiritual realities. Some of these new seekers parted company with mainstream Hindu tradition altogether, and eventually developed into whole new communities of belief and practice. One such community is now called the Jain tradition, named after the Jinas or spiritual conquerors to whom tradition attributes its founding spirit. The demanding ascetic discipline taught by Jainism's Tirthankaras, those who find crossing places in the river, formed one of the religious options available as early Buddhism developed. Buddhism itself would join Jainism as one of a number of splinter groups that, from a Hindu perspective, were unacceptable. These heretics got the name Nastika. Those who deny the fundamentals of Hindu belief as it was evolving then. What we now call Buddhism thus grew out of an age of political and spiritual ferment, offering seekers one of a number of significant religious options.
Are the Druze Muslims?
During the early 11th century, a ruler, Al-Hakim, d. 1021, of the Fatimid dynasty, a type of Sevener Shiites, did not argue when his followers began to claim that he was divine. Among al-Hakim's supporters was a Turk named Darazi. Even after Darazi died and his former arch-rival claimed that he himself was the true spokesman of al-Hakim, the name of Darazi would live on in the word Druze. Fatimid Ismaili doctrine had long shown very esoteric tendencies in interpreting the role of its 7 imams, and a similar esotericism remains a hallmark of Druze teaching. A collection of letters attributed to al-Hakim form the core sacred literature of the very closed and secretive communities, which now, for the most part, inhabit Lebanon, Syria, and the northern occupied West Bank of Palestine. Their esoteric teachings about al-Hakim, along with notions of reincarnation and other decidedly non-Islamic themes, leave them very much outside the fold of Islam.
Is exorcism important in Shinto practice?
Demons and assorted evil influences miss no opportunity to make nuisances of themselves, especially at times when human beings and natural processes are most vulnerable. Beginnings, such as planting time or the birth of an infant, can be particularly difficult in this respect. Shinto tradition includes various understandings of how evil forces work and several methods for contending with them. Most undesirable forces are associated with impurity and pollution. Some evil spirits will depart in a ritual that designates as a scapegoat any animal or object capable of taking on the negative forces. Emperors of old rubbed a human effigy over their bodies, leaving all personal impurity on the image, which officials of the Bureau of Yin and Yang then ritually consigned to a river. Other rituals use a weapon such as a sword to attack the evil power as though it were a physical presence. Some rituals assume the evil forces have taken on demonic bodies and must be pursued and expelled from a locality. In one rite, people throw soybeans in unlucky directions and command the demons to depart. An important part of the spring Setsubun, season change. Matsuri. Some large festivals are entirely dedicated to a type of communal exorcism. An originally Buddhist rite called Goryeo, meeting with august spirits, has been associated with Kyoto's famous Jun Matsuri, for example. That festival arose out of a need to banish the spirits of disease, and eventually grew into a full-scale Shinto celebration. Another important interpretation of spirit possession has been traditionally associated with the belief that the fox is capable of changing shapes. Extraordinary spiritual states were therefore sometimes explained as a type of fox possession. Some popular traditions identify various psychosomatic illnesses as forms of possession. Soul pacification, tamashizume, is a kind of reverse exorcism in which ritualists seek to make a spirit content to remain in the body of a person suffering from illness.
What were the 4 passing sites?
On several occasions the young Gautama had to leave the confines of the palace. Although his father instructed his servants to clear the road of any unsightly reminders of human frailty, Gautama would nevertheless find himself asking the hardest questions of all. On one excursion, he saw someone bent and struggling to walk. Old age, his servants explained, a hardship many people must eventually face. Another time, Gautama spotted a leper lying by the way in pain. That was illness, his servants explained, it happened to many people. Then one day Gautama's entourage came across a funeral procession. Death, said his servants, and no one escapes that. Finally, according to the traditional account, Gautama saw by the road a young man who obviously possessed nothing and yet seemed content. That was the world renouncer Shuddhodana so badly wanted his son not to become. The traditional account holds that all of the 4 experiences resulted from divine intervention. The gods assuming the roles of suffering human beings so that Gautama would be moved to take the next critical steps in ensuring the possibility of enlightenment for humankind. The clearly formulaic account admirably sums up the key issues that would eventually provide the foundations of Gautama's enlightenment and Buddhahood.
What are the 10 Commandments?
Also known as the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments as they are most widely known from Exodus 20. 1 to 17 are actually an abbreviated version of the law revealed to Moses at Sinai. The first 3 concern Israel's relationship to God. They forbid idolatry, the worship of gods other than God, along with making images of God, and prohibit taking the name of God in vain. Believers are commanded to keep the Sabbath holy as God did after the labor of creation. Commandments 4 through 10 have to do with proper behavior toward fellow human beings. They begin with the need to honor one's parents. They then enjoin against a series of 5 evils: murder, adultery, theft, lying and defaming another, and coveting anything that belongs to a neighbor, including members of his family. The Decalogue is followed by scores of more specific regulations concerning every conceivable area of ordinary life that further interpret the details implied in the 10 Commandments. Thus the 10 function as a kind of minimum ethical standard. Following them carefully, even in a general way, is challenging enough. But to observe them in the full detail given in Scripture is another matter altogether.
What role do views of life on earth play in Jewish tradition?
Although many Jews prefer not to speculate about whether some version of a next world may exist, many others believe there will be some form of reward or punishment after death. Nevertheless, life as we know it deserves far more attention than any possible hereafter. Jewish tradition would agree with the poet Robert Frost's observation that earth is the right place for loving. As a result, a major emphasis in Jewish tradition is the commitment to bettering the lot of humankind here and now. All of life is a gift worth receiving gladly and sharing with others. The well-known Jewish toast in Hebrew, Elichayim to life, sums it up. Wealth, success. The influence one can wield through involvement in community affairs all are an integral part of Jewish spirituality. To such things guilt is not an appropriate response.
Apart from the trigrams and taiji, what are some common traditional symbols?
Ancient lore associates fundamental features of Chinese cosmology with specific symbols. It all goes back to the Chinese atom, Pangu. In his task of imposing order on primal chaos, Pangu enlisted the help of 5 cosmic assistants: Azure Dragon, White Tiger, Phoenix, Tortoise, and Unicorn. Pangu assigned to each of the first 4 a quarter of the universe. Azure Dragon governed the east, associated with spring, new life, benevolence, and protection. White tiger ruled the autumnal west, symbol of maturity and a life well spent. All made possible by good government and courage. Phoenix, the ultimate solar bird. Presided over the summery south with the kindly warmth and joy that arises in a world at peace. Hard-shelled and indomitable, the ageless tortoise faced the unforgiving, wintry north. Wandering freely among them all, the rare and delicate unicorn was commissioned to appear wherever and whenever benevolence and justice reigned on earth. It is not surprising that all 5 of these wondrous beings retain their appeal to the popular imagination and remain essentials of the religious symbolic repertoire. A cluster of items associated loosely with Daoism are called the 8 Daoist emblems. Each represents one of the 8 immortals, a group of human beings who became immortal in various ways. They appear often as decorative motifs on all kinds of objects. The emblems are a fan, a sword, a gourd, castanets, a flower basket, a bamboo drum, a flute, and a lotus flower. This is one of several sets of 8 motifs popular in Chinese art and, along with the 8 Buddhist emblems, one that still carries specifically religious resonances.
Do Jews mark their sacred spaces with any distinctive signs and symbols?
In many parts of the world, Jewish places of worship have developed architecturally in the context of the local culture. The one architectural feature that sometimes distinguishes synagogues from nearby religious structures is that synagogues often have a central dome. Many mosques and churches have domes as well. But domed churches typically also have some sort of tower or spire, and mosques have a minaret or 2. Synagogues with central domes rarely have prominent flanking towers. A common decorative item that can mark synagogues externally is the twin tablets of the law, a reminder of Moses' reception of the revelation at Sinai. A large Star of David often graces the facade or windows. Synagogues of more contemporary style often place a menorah of monumental scale, and sometimes even very abstract design, in front. One small but remarkable synagogue, that of Jerusalem's Hadassah Medical Center, boasts a striking array of symbolic decor. Famed artist Marc Chagall designed a series of 12 windows to adorn the upper walls of all 4 sides of the room. Each of the windows recalls one of the 12 tribes, coordinating each window's colors with the intensity of natural light available through the day on the various sides of the space. Chagall arranged the windows roughly in order of the age of the patriarch from whom each took its name. As the sun makes its round, it illumines each in turn. Chagall placed Reuben, the oldest, on the east, and Joseph and Benjamin, the youngest, at the other end of the sun's circuit. Each window is bursting with Chagall's own unique choice. of symbolic reminders of the stories of each tribe.
What kinds of rituals do Muslims engage in privately or alone?
Since one can perform the 5 daily ritual prayers anywhere, most Muslims generally pray the Salat alone or in small groups. In mosques everywhere you can find individual Muslims praying privately outside the regular ritual prayer times as well. But Muslims also engage in a variety of other private devotions. Some are associated with local or regional custom, others practiced across the globe. Private recitation of the sacred scripture is foremost among the universal customs. Muslims who read Arabic but who are not formally trained in the refinements of performative recitation often sit alone and recite in a low voice. Meditative reading of the text in any language can nourish the spiritual life. Another popular devotion involves a prayerful consideration of the 99 beautiful names of God. Many Muslims use the tasbihah, a set of either 33 or 99 beads, to keep count. These are the so-called worry beads people all over the world like to fidget with even when not praying. Islamic traditions of spirituality also offer a vast array of devotional literature. From hagiography, lives of prophets and holy persons, to prayers recommended for daily use to refined religious poetry suitable for praying.
What about devils or demons?
Numerous demons, oni, inhabit the cosmos of popular Shinto belief. But their particular province is the north. They are associated with negative forces generally and bad luck. Rough spirits, Eremidama, are among the larger category of generic spirits or souls. A category of beings called Onryo consists of angry spirits. Other beings called Goryo, or august spirits, are also generally troublesome but deserving of respect for their power. Some of Shinto's most important shrines are known as Goryo shrines. Because the kami dwelling there was once a human being who died under inauspicious circumstances. Another large category of evil spirits is that of Bakemono, a term that refers to several specific groups of beings especially prevalent in folklore.
What questions does the prospect of interfaith marriage raise?
Attitudes toward marriage between members of two religious traditions vary considerably. In some traditions interfaith unions raise relatively little concern, but many others typically either forbid them altogether or take serious official exception and place explicit restrictions on such marriages. Many Muslims and Catholics, for example, continue to hold that interfaith marriages are to be discouraged because of the problems that often arise in the religious education of children. In some communities it is assumed that the intended spouse from another tradition, most often the wife, will agree either to convert or to see that the children receive solid grounding in the spouse's tradition. In the long run, interfaith marriage holds the potential threat of one tradition's gradual assimilation and loss of identity in favor of a dominant tradition.
Who was the Buddha and what does tradition say about his early life?
According to widely accepted tradition, a child called Siddhartha, he who has achieved his goal, Gautama, was born around 563 BCE. Recent scholarship has begun to offer various views as to the chronology of the Buddha's life. But this text will retain the more traditional account since it conveys an important sense of the feel of Buddhist lore. Siddhartha's father, Shuddhodana, was a wealthy member of the ruling elite, a prince of sorts. When the child was born, his father consulted religious specialists to see what portents the boy's body might communicate. They told him the child was destined to become either a world renouncer or a wheel turner, Chakravartin, an expression roughly equivalent to mover and shaker and sometimes extended to mean king of all India. Shuddhodana resolved that his son would take the path of power and influence. So he contrived to shelter the boy from any experience that might incline him another way. Gautama lived a life of ease and pleasure in his father's palace. Surrounded by wealth and beauty and the trappings of authority, he married at 16 and had a son. As it turned out, Gautama's father failed to insulate his son from contact with the harsher side of life. Eventually Gautama would leave the palace, as well as his own wife and child, and seek his own path. The traditional story is clearly meant to underscore certain dramatic elements in the Buddha's spiritual development. His son, Rahula, reappears later in the story as one of the early monks, and his wife is said to have become one of the first nuns.
Why are Muslims buried in white shrouds?
Since Muslims believe that death is the great equalizer between rich and poor, kings and servants, burials are kept as simple as possible. The shroud is a symbol of that common destiny, showing that no matter how much a person owns, all is left behind when the deceased goes on to another spiritual life. Typically, a coffin is used to transport the body to the cemetery. Then the body is removed from the coffin and buried.
Is there a standard deist group liturgical worship?
Most of the ritual activity one can observe at temples throughout the day consists of individual or family worship at various times during the day. Members of pious organizations may gather for group chanting of liturgical prayers. The priest may address a sermon to such gatherings as well. Major Daoist sects have devised their own special communal rituals, and some have survived intact into our time and are still practiced, especially in rural areas and more traditional villages. Many of these involve group chanting of sacred texts, in imitation of the chanting of the assembled gods themselves when they created the universe. One important communal ritual is that based on the teachings of the Lingbao sect. Elaborate theatrical liturgies address issues and powers in 3 levels or registers: the celestial, the terrestrial, and the human. The Golden Register of Rituals honors the family of the emperor at the celestial level. A terrestrial level called the Yellow Register is aimed at peaceful rest for the deceased. The now discontinued Jade Register once focused on securing salvation for all people. The officiants and their ritual implements mediate between the divine and human participants. Rites once dedicated to the emperor and his court are now undertaken on behalf of local or family groups known to uphold religious standards. Observances begin with an evening or vespers prayer to announce the start of the rituals and symbolically reconstruct a sacred realm in which to enact the rites. Great attention goes into setting the ritual scene. A miniature of the cosmos with gates at the 4 cardinal directions. Action resumes the next morning with a fast and an offering. Imitating a creative divine act, the officiant recreates the sacred space by pacing out creation and journeys symbolically to the heavens to bring down heavenly powers. As part of the ritual, the master, or priest, meditates silently, focusing on visual imagery as a way of bringing health to the assembled people. The entire ritual ends on the next day with the master facing the assembly as one now returned to earth. He then dismantles the altar, burns the sacred texts, and sends the deities back to their heavenly abodes.
What is a mandarin?
Mandarin comes from the Sanskrit term mantri, meaning minister or counselor. It became common especially after the 16th century, when Europeans came into more regular contact with Chinese culture. Europeans used the term to refer to China's social elite, so that Mandarin was in effect a synonym for literati. Technically, that meant all the bureaucrats who belonged to the 9 administrative ranks of imperial government or civil service. When the Italian Jesuit missionary Matteo Ricci, 1552–1610, determined to dedicate himself to working in China, he set out to steep himself in classical Confucian learning. An important feature of his reputation is that he was so successful that he virtually became a Mandarin. In popular usage, the term Mandarin has come to refer to Asian social and cultural elites and governmental administrators in general. Mandarin is also the name given to one of the most important and widely spoken of the many Chinese dialects.
What is a rite of passage?
In the life of every individual, certain times naturally stand out as particularly significant. Birth, the transition from childhood to adulthood, or puberty. The assumption of a new state in life, as in a marriage, and death are especially critical times. Religious traditions generally acknowledge these and other formative experiences. By developing rituals designed to help people cope with the changes they bring. Sheer difficulty and challenge can sometimes be the distinguishing features of important moments or phases of a life. Confusion, sense of loss and grief, even overwhelming joy or feelings of limitless possibility can be cause for recourse to the comfort and direction rites of passage can afford. Rituals of this kind help believers by allowing them to step out of ordinary time and space for a while to regain their bearings. They can then return to real life feeling renewed, spiritually refreshed, and strengthened for the challenges ahead.